Hello, everybody, and good evening. Welcome to Kansas Avenue Health Ministries presentation. I first want to start off with a word of prayer, so that's what we're going to do right now. Dear Jesus, thank you for letting us all come here today and listen to these great men talk about some health topics within our community. Please bless this presentation. Please help everybody to learn something new or to refresh on information that they may already know. Please bless everybody's week, and we're going into the weekend that everybody stay safe and healthy. And in Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so let me do an introduction of our speakers. So tonight you will be hearing from Dr. Columbus Batiste. He is a board-certified interventional cardiologist based in Southern California. He received his doctorate of medicine from Loma University, and you'll also be hearing from Dr. Eric Walsh, and he received a double doctorate in medicine as well as public health, and he serves as a medical director for urgent care services. They founded Slave Food Project, which is a nonprofit that encourages health and wellness by providing information on the essential tools needed to live a better lifestyle. So for the next few minutes, you'll be hearing from Dr. Batiste and Dr. Walsh.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity to present to you all. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to be back with Kansas Avenue.
Yes. Virtually. All right. Well, let's dive into it, dig into the information here today. Let's go ahead with the share our screen. All right. So, a lot has really transpired since we were last at Kansas. It's my home church. I miss everyone tremendously. And the opportunity that we had to go and present to you all was a unique time that we were able to gather together. And it's something that we've lost, something we haven't been able to do. And there's been one common thread as to why we haven't, and that's called the coronavirus, COVID-19. It's really ravaged and rampaged across the world, and specifically inside the United States. One of the things we know is that you can't start any conversation about health and wellness without addressing COVID-19, without addressing the devastation that it's caused, both on a granular level in terms of impacting everyone's health around the world, is what we've seen consistently. But one of the things that's been very unique is that early part of 2021, what we're seeing is that COVID, as a result of deaths, is causing a higher toll than the number one killer of Americans and globally since 1918, in that of heart disease. The reason why I went into cardiology, and COVID-19 is the leading cause of this currently. It would be one thing if it were just causing an issue as it pertains to deaths and hospitalizations, but it's also tearing families apart. We're seeing that there's a tremendous impact on family dynamics, and domestic abuse and depression and anxiety is what we're seeing. We're seeing this mental health impact from COVID-19, and from this physical distancing, social distancing is impacting every occupant of the world. It's significant. And one of the things that it's really clearly outlined. So one of the things is that COVID has done is it's unleashed and uncovered America's dirty little secret. It's told us that America is living sick, and it's living sicker, and it's dying sooner than other countries. And so COVID has shown us that out of all the disease entities, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, emphysema, chronic kidney disease are the ones in which it attacks. And we've all heard this throughout the course of 2020, extending into it. This impact is weighed a toll on us, on our kids forced to learn remotely, on our adults, on our essential workers, and it's led to a stress and really tugging and pulling. This combined with the political dynamics in our country, this combined with the racial strife in our country is what it's shown. Yes, America is living sicker and dying sooner. And so when we compare the United States to other Western countries, we see that the United States is more inclined to have chronic disease burden. We know that 60% of Americans have at least one chronic disease, and 40% have two or more. What we know is, if that were the only thing, that would be fine. But we're seeing that out of all of the industrialized countries listed, that it's Americans are living the shortest life expectancy at the bottom toll of everything is what we're seeing. Coronavirus didn't just reveal that, it's also shown us distinctly the inequities as it pertains to it, that impacts Black and Brown communities disproportionately. And we've seen that members of our community have been suffering, jobless, struggling to figure out what to do next as they're searching and looking for other opportunities. And so COVID has really struck a chord, as now there is some gleam of hope is what we're seeing now, but there's still, it brings about the question, why is it that Black people live sicker and die sooner than other people?
And this is a question we've worked on for a long time. And as we began to look at, you can look at the geography of it. A lot of people think that what's going to make them healthy or unhealthy is their genetic code, their DNA. But what the evidence actually shows is health is better predicted by your zip code, where you live. And this is a map of Washington, D.C. We won't get deep into it, but if you go from the Capitol Heights station down in Southeast DC out to Maryland, you can see that there are huge changes in life expectancy. But it's not just DC. For every mile you travel from Capitol Heights out to the Shady Grove station, it's like for every mile you travel, it's like a 1.5 year increase in life expectancy. That's pretty incredible. And here you can see the zip codes. These are California zip codes. You can see the life expectancy is 73 in one and 88 in the other. Are these Riverside zip codes, Columbus?
No. These are just sporadic throughout.
I think this is actually up in the Bay Area. Actually.
Yes.
All right. And Atlanta, same thing. You can look at North Atlanta. You see how much longer people live than if you look at more central and south sides of Atlanta. Detroit, same thing. Depending on where you live in Detroit, you can see as low as 69, as high as 82. Where you live matters. Chicago, same thing, as high as 85-year life expectancy compared to 69. Jersey, same thing, 87 years, nice long life expectancy, as low as 73 in other areas. Philadelphia, same thing. So African Americans are 50% more likely to have heart disease than white people, 40% more likely to die at an early age from any cause, and 19% could not afford to see a doctor. And that is from the Centers for Disease Control.
Yeah, and one of the things that we realize is the fact that every age bracket. So, a lot of times people think that disease is a burden of the elderly, but we recognize that every age bracket, African Americans tend to live sicker. We are more inclined to have high blood pressure, more inclined to have diabetes, more inclined to have strokes as it pertains when compared to Caucasians across the board. And as a result of that, we see
the average life expectancy, again, is just huge. I mean, Asian Americans, 87, African Americans here, 75. I remember working in LA County, and we did the county health department did a whole life expectancy study. If you wanted to live long in LA County, you needed to be an Asian woman. I think it was like 89-year life expectancy. Black men didn't, on average, live to see 70. So it's a huge. And so there's some studies that were done that shows you that back in 1990 that reported that the death rates per 100,000 for people 35 to 54. So these aren't young people in accidents and homicides and so forth. And it's not older people. This is the middle-aged people, 35 to 54. The death rate per 100,000 was 2.3 times higher for African Americans than for whites. So you say, well, it must be some of these other things. So you adjust for smoking, blood pressure, cholesterol, weight, BMI, alcohol, diabetes. It goes from 2.3 to 1.9. So you still have a pretty significant difference. If you add in income, it drops to 1.4 times. That leaves about a third of the difference unexplained. So it's not simply economics or even habits. There's something else going on. And when you control for poverty, you still wind up with like 38,000 deaths a year or 1.1 million years of life lost among African Americans in the U.S. So we put some pictures of some notable individuals here who did die early. Bernard Tyson, most recently, who was the head of Kaiser Permanente. So we see that this is actually real, and it touches real people, and it takes years off that they could be contributing to society and just doing beneficial things.
One of the key things is the fact that a lot of times, we think Kansas is filled with health professionals, myself included. And so you think, okay, well, I know better, right? And so it's not going to impact me. And so there was a study that was done many years ago comparing the evolution of heart disease inside of African Americans and Caucasians. And they looked at graduates from Meharry and they looked at graduates from Johns Hopkins and they compared the two. And what they found is that despite the similar level of education, despite the similar financial strata, that there was a disproportionate amount of heart attacks higher in those those physicians of African descent. And so it was irrespective of education, irrespective of income, as we mentioned.
So the question is, what does this all really mean? And as you look at it, it's the equivalent of like 265 deaths a day, like a jumbo jet plane crashing every single day. And every 7 minutes, there's a premature death of an African American. I mean, so to kind of quantify it, that's what you see.
Another aspect of things when we look at this is the fact there's a cost. A lot of times we speak about this is African American history. Well, this is the United States History Month that we're in, and we're filling it with things that we perhaps were not taught inside of grade school, inside of high school. And so when we look at African American health or health disparities, it's not an African American or a racial issue, it's an American issue. And what we see as a result of this is we see excessive economic losses, 35 billion in healthcare expenditures, 10 billion in illness-related lost productivity, and nearly 200 billion in premature deaths. Now, what these premature deaths mean is that individuals who work their whole lives, but then are never able to reap the rewards of retirement, their social security that can be passed on generationally. And so it's very much so a major problem is what we're seeing.
So the question is, why do Black people die sicker and sooner than everyone else? And we believe that a big part of what makes that last nexus, that third of the deaths unexplained, is actually stress. And stress is defined as a condition or a feeling that a person perceives when a person perceives that demands the weight of what they need to do. The demands exceed the personal and social resources the individual is able to mobilize. And we quantify this in an equation. Stress equals demands minus resources. So as your demands go up, your stress goes up. As your resources go down, your ability to manage your demands goes down, and so your stress goes up. And we often talk about the fight or flight. I always make the joke about running from dogs when I was a kid because the neighborhoods were kind of rough. What happens when you start getting chased by the dog, of course, is that you have a release of cortisol, adrenaline. You go into fight or flight mode. Food is shunted away from your blood is shunted away from your digestive tract into your big muscles. You get more focus. Blood flow increases to the brain. Your blood pressure goes up. Your heart rate goes up. You start to make sugar in your liver. A plethora of things begin to happen. And all of these things help you to acutely get away from the danger. The problem is, if every day you're facing that type of stress, over time, it causes problems. Going back to coronavirus, it's a pro-inflammatory disease. That's why all of those diseases that are listed, like obesity and heart disease and stuff, cause problems. They're also pro-inflammatory. Being in a constant state of stress is pro-inflammatory. When your cortisol levels stay high all the time, your immune system loses its ability to downregulate inflammation. So stress is a major way that people actually get disease. It's chronic stress that does that. So chronic exposure to stress, poor social supports, and limited social network have been shown to increase disease risk. Low perceived control is a determinant of heightened stress responses and poor adaptation. So when you don't feel you have control, you're more stressed out. So we'll show you more on that in a second. Go ahead, Columbus.
Yeah, no, and just to highlight this slide once again, because this is none other than 2020. When we look at the stress, we look at poor social supports from physical distancing. We look at the limited social networks. And so individuals inside these pods of isolation. And so that's where really the church steps in the gap to really bridge and allow that connectivity as much as possible with churches like Kansas Avenue.
So adversity and vulnerability, along with psychological markers, such as low self-esteem and loneliness, are also associated with poor health outcomes. This is a year where a lot of people have felt lonely, for sure. In fact, many, I believe, of the elderly who are dying in nursing homes, a big contributing factor to their sickness is they can't get visitors and they feel trapped and so forth. But the low self-esteem part, I think, actually speaks also to African Americans, who many of us grew up believing, because we were darker, our noses were thicker, our hair was kinky. We grew up thinking that we weren't as beautiful or weren't as worthwhile. And so we had lower self-esteem, which increases the stress as well. And so we have this one here, which goes back to the perceived control. So, you would say, who has more stress, the CEO or the guy in the mailroom, the Queen of England, or, the person, taking care of her horses outside in the stable? Well, the person with the most stress is the person with the least control. So the more, as you can see from this from here, I would throw this into the COVID mix, that those people who have the ability to stay home and work, think of the advantage where you could, in this thing, where you had the control to say, look, I'm going to stay home and work, compared to those who still had to get on a public transportation and go to work every day. That speaks, that kind of is a great analogy of what happens when you don't have control.
Absolutely. And that same sort of dichotomy with the low job control has a higher likelihood of coronary artery disease. The higher your level of stress, the more susceptible you are to manifesting disease symptoms from an infection. So studies have shown that, looking at influenza and other forms of the coronavirus, not specifically COVID-19, but other forms of that. And so we see that consistently.
So social support at work as a risk factor for poor mental health. And you can see here, if you have high social support at work, you do better. Medium social support at work, as you go across, you can see how not having social support at work can actually impact your mental health. So one of the statements I like to make, and we've actually made it into a slide, is that racism is a statement about a person's value. And in America, like most of the world, resources most often go where value is perceived. So if something happens and there's a bad earthquake, you could almost bet that those wealthy neighborhoods are going to get resources faster than some of the poorer neighborhoods. And a unique stressor. So when we talk about this, we talk about race and racism. It is a unique stressor, because when any of these individuals, regardless of the circumstances of their death, when this comes through the waves and we hear about it, we think about, this could have been me, this could have been my child, this could have been my friend, my cousin. Collectively, Black America's stress goes up when any of these events, when someone is shot and killed by the police, or held down and killed by the police. It's a collective stressor. And this is just one very acute way. There are many other ways that this happens across Black America, as we'll talk about here in a second.
Yeah, and so one of the key things that we know, and many people will say, well, you know what, that's not everyone, and that's not me. But, you ask yourself, and so there was great work done by David Williams out of Harvard. And so he, developed this thing called the Everyday Discrimination Scale, some microaggression type of a scale. And if you ever ask yourself, are you frequently treated with less courtesy than others? Are you frequently treated with less respect than others? Are you frequently receiving poor service than others? Frequently, people think you're not smart. Frequently, people are afraid of you. People act like you're dishonest, or they act as if they're better than you. I reflect on this recently, right after the storming of the Capitol. I remember walking inside the OR that same very week, walked in the OR to grab some PPE, personal protection equipment, as I was preparing for a procedure. And I walked over and I was looking and searching through, and someone walked up to me and said, "Excuse me, who are you? Do you belong here? Are you supposed to be here taking our stuff?" In that moment, I began to wonder, is she saying this because of how I look? Because and so these things weigh on you. They erode at your person and who you are. And that's what's called the Everyday Discrimination Scale.
Mm-hmm. So racial discrimination is linked to a higher risk of chronic illness in Black women. And there's a lot of data on this around how it increases the risk of a lot of specific things for African American women. Women who said they faced racial discrimination on the job and housing and from the police were 48% more likely to develop breast cancer than those who reported no incidents of major discrimination. Another study of African American women found that those who reported chronic emotional stress due to their experience of racism had more severely blocked carotid arteries. That speaks to stress and the way it impacts cortisol and inflammation. The study showed increased coronary artery calcium score in patients with racial discrimination stress. I'll let the cardiologist kind of explain what that means.
Yeah. So when you get that calcification, that brightness, that bright appearance, think of it like your garden hose that's baking out inside the Inland Empire or the desert that's out there. Over time, that rubber is going to get stiff. It's going to get hard. It's going to get rigid. And that's what happens to your arteries over time. So not the stressors of the sun, but the stressors of life. And this is what it's a reflection of. And so it's a marker of future events. And that's something that one of the ways in which we determine that is through a particular type of scoring system.
So racism is a form of stress that actually can shorten telomeres. And when that happens, so there's a statement here at the same chronological age, Black women had accelerated biological aging of about 7.5 years. And Dr. Matisovin says, we say Black don't crack, but that doesn't mean on the inside it's not cracking. And the telomere shortening is actually a predictor of longevity. When I was in Australia, I had a chance to go into one of the public health departments. Something I found interesting from Australia's Department of Public Health, and these posters are old now, but they actually made posters that say racism makes me sick. It affects my blood pressure and creates anxiety and depression. For the woman, it damages my heart, blood pressure, and my unborn baby. And these are Aboriginal people, but the principle is the same. Oppression is oppression, and the effects of it are very stressful.
Yeah, and it speaks to the fact that you can't escape your skin of how you look on the outside. And so what we find distinctly throughout all of this is that our health is tied to our stress. Our health equals our resiliency divided by our stress. In other words, the higher your stress, the poorer your health. The higher your stress, the poorer your health is one thing that we consistently see throughout science and throughout literature. And what do many of us do when we get stressed? We turn to a double date with Ben and Jerry's. We go and we dig into something that we otherwise might not choose. And indeed, stress is simply dessert spelled backwards. And one of the things that we know this, it was a great study that was done out of Stanford by Baba Sheeb. And what he did is he took two groups of individuals and he said to them, listen, I'm going to give you a sequence of digits to remember. And your job is to go out and to teach and repeat these digits to other people. And so to the group that he gave 8, 9, 10 digits, compared to the group he gave 1 or 2 digits, he now set them out with an option when they exited the room. They all had the intent of trying to eat healthier. And which group would you guess was more inclined to eat the chocolate cake? The ones who were stressed, who had the stress of going out for public speaking, the stress of trying to remember the excess numbers. And so he demonstrated some of the ill effects of stress just in that moment. And this idea lends itself to something called nutritional stress, that everything we do is adding to our resiliency or adding to our stress. And what is nutritional stress? It's eating. Of course, we know it's eating disease-forming foods. That makes sense. When I see someone in my office, I ask you, what are you eating for your health? Don't tell me what you're eating. And don't tell me in terms of macronutrients of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, but what are you eating for your health? So we know it's eating, it's eating disease-forming foods, but it's also not eating the health-promoting foods is what we understand about nutritional stress. And the foods that we eat create stress in our bodies. And so there's a study that was done and it compared animal protein compared to beans, to legumes. And what they found was that there was an increase, a heightening amount of salivary cortisol. They measured the cortisol inside the saliva and they found it to be markedly elevated inside those who were eating the animal proteins. And so that was one demonstration. Another one is called oxidative stress. Now, this is kind of like the rusting. And so easy way I always describe oxidative stress, even though these are two health promoting foods, is imagine what happens when you cut a banana. It turns brown over time, doesn't it? What happens when you cut an apple? It turns brown. What happens when you take out blueberries or blackberries or raspberries or strawberries? They stay the same color. They resist that oxidation that's there. So this oxidation happens on the inside. And so what we know is on a cellular level, you get attacked by these free radicals. They're coming in to disrupt you, right? To attack the normal state of your family dynamics or of your body, which is the family. And when this happens, it then lends itself to degradation and problems throughout. So once again, another demonstration of this is that these free radicals that circulate around from our environment, from the sun, from our foods that we're eating, from inactivity, from secondhand smoke, all these things come and they steal your health away from you, these electrons. When we ingest these antioxidants, they sacrifice themselves. There's a distinct spiritual connection right here in terms of that sacrifice of the antioxidants in order to save that healthy atom that's right there, right? And to stand in the gap in between it. So this food can be a form of stressor that we can offset through the foods that we eat. And so many of us think that, well, doc, this is my legacy. This is who we are. This is where we stem from. And so I'm just solely eating the things as I'm celebrating this month of February because it's our legacy. But we have a different legacy.
And there's definitely a different legacy. And my times traveling in Africa and even in the Caribbean tells me that, especially when you go to Africa, there are amazing foods, fruits, greens, berries, and so forth that don't even exist in the West that are very healthy. And our ancestors had a predominantly whole food plant-based diet. And this one is here. Agricultural researchers and nutrition experts argue that indigenous vegetables are richer in protein, vitamins, iron, and other nutrients than non-indigenous foods, and this is indigenous to Africa. And long overlooked in parts of Africa, indigenous greens are now capturing the attention of their nutritional and environmental benefits. So we as Africans used to have access to the best foods in the world, honestly.
We have a question from Erin Lindsay. She said, how do you think the stereotyping for healthcare providers impacts how Black patients seek medical care?
That's a good question. And so, we'll touch on that before, but implicit bias plays a role in general. We know that there's studies that have shown that certain groups, African-American men specifically, and some others are maybe perhaps more inclined to undertake some preventative strategies to resonate and to develop a bond with individuals that will allow them to receive the care that they need to receive in particular instances. I think it plays a role in recognizing the fact of establishing a relationship, and communication plays a substantial role for individuals to feel comfortable, to feel safe, to feel that that provider, whether or not they look just like you or they look different, is looking out for your best interest. And so it's important that one seek out providers. It's like dating, I always say. Your doctor, it doesn't mean that you're one and done. It's just doesn't mean that doctor's a bad doctor, but perhaps they're not right for you. They don't communicate well with you. So you have to search and look for the perfect nurse practitioner, physician, PA, whomever it may be, that resonates with you and can communicate with you. And that's something that you may find in different sections.
So
Eric, I'll turn.
Oh yeah, so food has changed. This talks about saltwater slavery, but food was an important element of the process of turning humans into commodities. When I went to one of the slave castles in Ghana, it was terrible because they showed how they used to use food to actually set people against each other, to punish people, and before they'd send them to the door of no return onto slave ships to go to the West. They use food to actually control people. On the ship, they would ration food in such a way to try and maximize their profits. So the less food they fed everybody, hundreds of slaves and sailors on these ships, they try to not give them as much food as possible to the slaves to try and increase profit. So food itself was a part. Nutrition itself was weaponized in this process. So Africans, of course, adapted their cultures to the influences, resources, and severe restrictions they experienced in slavery. Slaves often were issued what was considered to be the lesser cut of the hog: the feet, the head, the ribs, the fat back, or internal organs. This is where we get chitlins from, pig's feet, and all this kind of stuff. These were never to be eaten. In general, obviously, pork was never to be eaten, but it was used as a way to kind of give you the nastiest part of a animal that was already considered unclean. Frederick Douglass says it like this. He says, rations consisted of a monthly allowance of a bushel of third-rate corn, pickled pork, and poorest quality herrings. barely enough to sustain grown men and women through the back-breaking labors in the field. And what we say is that what really was happening was, of course, they wanted to give you enough nutrition so you could work from Kansas City morning to Kansas City night, but they didn't want to give you enough nutrition to where you were strong enough to actually want to rebel or try and escape.
And one of the things that we recognize when we talk about soul food is we oftentimes it's a remembrance of these types of foods, the internal organs, and essentially our ancestors making lemonade out of lemons. But what we fail to recognize the resiliency that many of our forefathers, they went, and before they went out to the fields, they tended their own fields. They grew vegetables. They went ahead and searched in order to augment and optimize. And so we need to really tap into that resiliency that was found. And so in this rise of soul food, one of the things that transpired during that time is this idea of the tabletop, the Sunday dinner, the Sabbath dinner, and they would come together at this one time. Some historians have said that slaves were given their rations on Saturdays, and on Sundays was their one time that they felt free. And they would come together cooking and making their best foods and eating. And this celebration is what began to take place in that period of time. And as slavery ended and the Great Migration began because of Jim Crow era, with folks spreading out to the north and other areas out of the Deep South, is what you found is that they carried with them some of these ideas, but unfortunately they were met inside of segregated areas in the north. They were met inside of environments where were stacked with rooms, and you maybe had one kitchen to multiple rooms, or multiple families had to share. And so they were forced into this idea of deep frying quickly. They were forced into an idea of transforming the way in which they ate, at least to supplement their diets down in the South, and transitioning that somewhat. And so during this period of time, they were some of the earliest consumers of street foods, of vendor foods, and so forth, of Chinese food, Italian food, and others, because of the situation and circumstances of their living environment. As things progressed and civil rights took forth, all of a sudden you saw that the cities were rocked by civil unrest, much of what we saw in 2020. And so Richard Nixon, the president at that time, said, listen, any act of racism is an act of communism. And he said, we have to revitalize these areas. And so he said, we need to instill institutions back inside these communities and give out small business association loans. Well, who swooped in for the small business association loans were those fast food companies, were liquor stores, were areas that were there already inside of communities that have been redlined and partitioned, where there are limited resources in terms of parks and schools and groceries to begin with. And now they became flooded because of the profit margin differences between those of the grocery stores compared to fast food companies, creating this supersizing of urban America. Now creating these crucibles of conflict, not only having the stressors of life, the stressors of trying to make ends meet, the stressors of racial discrimination, but now adding in the nutritional stress that's pervasive and is bred from youth all the way through throughout adulthood, creating these environments of weapons of mass destruction. I remember as a kid growing up in Compton that my older siblings would tell stories that they heard. Fortunately, they weren't out in the streets, but stories of where train doors would just open and stop. And out there were just arsenals of weapons that were there that people would run and they would grab. And so in a very similar fashion of this thought process, we were seeing the flooding of these weapons of mass destruction entering into these communities, areas that there.
So one of the things we talk about are food deserts. And a food desert is where there's a lack of whole food, nutritious food. And another way to say that, and obviously see all the fast food joints there, another way to say that is to call it food apartheid. And it's a term that a lot of people are starting to use. It considers the human aspect of this condition. In other words, someone intentionally designed some of our cities to be the way they are. So there are food deserts and there's food swamps. Food deserts in that you can't find healthy, nutritious food. Food swamps in that you can find a ton of cheap, empty calories all over the place, like you do at a fast food joint.
One of the things we know is that who are some of the highest consumers of fast food? It's African-American women. 43% of African-American women are consuming fast food on a regular basis. And what studies are telling us is that you consume fast food once a week, it increases your risk of heart disease by 20%, 2 to 3 times, 40 to 50%. 5 times or more, we're looking at nearly 80% based on a study out of University of Minnesota. Substantial, just living near the fast food increases the risk exponentially of heart attacks and devastation there.
So we know that the food advertising actually does target Black youth. We have a lot of ways that we present this, but so you can see the money spent to advertise on Black up-targeted TV channels, $135 million for fast food and other restaurant candy, sugary drinks, $2 million on yogurt and 100% juice. And 100% juice actually isn't very good either, nor yogurt, but $0 plain water, fruits, and vegetables. Yeah. You can see this. So someone, and let me tell you something, no one would spend the money they spend on a commercial if they didn't know it worked. Yeah. There's proof that it works is the fact that they'll spend so much money on it.
Absolutely. You know, on a side note, there was a group that was out of, I believe it was Yale, and what they challenged them to do is to create an advertisement campaign around vegetables. And what they did, and Michael Moss brought this up inside one of his books, the author of Fat, Salt, and Sugar, or Sugar, Salt, and Fat, he brought this up. And so what they did was they put together this ad campaign, and they pitted broccoli versus kale. And they had billboards all over and commercials, and all of a sudden the sales began to skyrocket. It's intentional in the efforts. It's planned and it's intentional to target certain groups. And we know the impact of our subconscious really as it pertains to a lot of the advertisements out there. Another area that we see is the dairy checkoff. Now, what's interesting, so we mentioned already that many of these fast food companies, and even to this day and age, they receive their monies through government subsidies. And so we also know the government also subsidizes the dairy. And so through this dairy checkoff system too as well, the government, what they end up doing is that your tax dollars go towards the financing of the advertisements. And so when you're seeing these extra cheesy stuff, pizza shells, and we're seeing these triple layer burgers with 5 layers of cheese sauce on it, and having these variables that are there, these are your tax dollars that are going into the advertisement. So the tax dollars are lowering the cost of the foods. The tax dollars are going in to fund small business association loans, and the tax dollars are going in to feed, in part, the advertisement that is concentrate inside of communities of color oftentimes, and communities of financial despair oftentimes.
And the irony is that the same government is telling you not to, giving you a food pyramid that would suggest you should actually eat less of many of these things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so as we see, and that's one of the key things you just mentioned right there, when we look at what they tell us to eat, you know, I remember inside of college, a roommate of mine would always do the opposite. If we said yes, he would shake his head no. If he said no, he'd shake his head yes. And so his actions were contradictory to what he was saying. And so what we're saying is the government tells us to eat healthfully, is what they tell us to do. They tell us to eat healthfully. But what they subsidize is the opposite. They subsidize the opposite. One of the key things that studies have shown is this association between what is subsidized versus the outcomes. So if you were to go ahead and just eat the foods that the government subsidizes, it tells us that you're more inclined to have what's this thing called cardiometabolic risk. Now, what does that mean? We're talking about, there's a concept. And so don't be fooled. Don't look at someone's weight and assume that they're unhealthy and you're healthy because you're thin. There's a concept out there called thin on the outside, TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. That when you have this fat that encases your organs, it's metabolically active. It causes this inflammatory state, which is one of the things that Dr. Walsh brought forth a little bit earlier on in terms of obesity having this pro-inflammatory state, which increases your risk around the COVID and this ailment that's out there, the pandemic. And so in this inflammatory state, it lends itself not only to diabetes, to cancers, to heart disease. Is part of the issue that we see. And so we see this very thing play out when you take in these foods that are subsidized, these foods that are subsidized by the government.
And I always say the tobacco industry was sued because they kept saying that their product was not addictive and it wasn't harmful. But the food industry says the opposite. They say once you pop, you can't stop. They say, bet you can't eat just one. and they mix sugar, salt, and fat, as Michael Moss's book talks about, and they basically engineer the food. They design the food so that once you start eating it, it's very difficult to stop eating it. And potato chips are a classic example of that. And so, we could talk about the bliss point. We could talk about cravings, vanishing calories. We may talk about that more the next time, but they literally have designed the food. I mean, and one of the guests we had on our Slave Food Project on Friday night, a gentleman that's living in Africa, he's from Detroit, I think, but he said, the business of business is business. And what he meant is, listen, when they make this food, they're not trying to make the food to make you healthy. They're trying to make the food to make money. And so, he was trying to say it isn't nefarious or intentional, but I don't know that it's very different from the tobacco industry, which actually wound up getting into bed with a lot of these processed food manufacturers along the way.
Absolutely. So
SNAP is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It actually gives money to stores that sell a lot of the foods the government says, but as we'll see, a lot of the food that they're being subsidized to sell is not good for you. And one of the classic bad government food ideas was what we call government cheese. A lot of people say government cheese, but it's government cheese. And government cheese is a block of the fat from dairy, from milk, that they could not use to do anything else with. They scooped it together and they started to make blocks of cheese that the dairy industry could then sell using our tax dollars, bought by the federal government, and distributed mostly to low-income families, Black families, Latino families, Native Americans. Even in Guam, when I was living in Guam, people got it. And it's basically a block of saturated fat, cholesterol, and salt. So one of the most dangerous things you could ever actually eat is that block of cheese. It actually has casomorphins in it, which is related to opiates. So it has a low grade level of direct addictive power as well.
That's why studies have shown out there, you ask people, what's the one thing you can't give up? And oftentimes it's cheese. Cheese is the answer. That's one of the hardest things for folks to get over in terms of level of addictiveness.
So SNAP subsidizes retailers for selling the same foods high in sugar, saturated fats, and sodium that the USDA tells Americans to avoid in the dietary guidelines. We mentioned this already. It is hypocrisy. And for those of you who understand the scripture, it is Revelation chapter 13. 2 horns like a lamb, but speaking like a dragon.
Yeah, and so here we talk about more than half of these SNAP benefits are taken by retailers for meats, sweetened beverages, prepared foods and desserts, cheese, salty snacks, candy, and sugar, but just 23.9% go for fruits, vegetables, grains, nuts, beans, seeds, and spices. So we're feeding, once again, this crucible of conflict that now we're not only is, once again, the food subsidized, small business association loans to place these businesses inside the communities. It's advertised, and now those on public assistance are given products where the retailers are selling them predominantly these same items that are subsidized in this vicious cycle, this crucible of conflict. And we wonder why we're dying at faster rates. And the issue in terms of food justice and health justice and health matters inside the community.
And then never forget, just to quickly go back, stressed equals dessert spelled backwards. So when you design these foods and stick them into a neighborhood where people have more stress and have more challenges, it really is a setup for these foods to not only sell more, but to be more detrimental to health. And as you can see, SNAP participants had poorer overall diet quality and consume more calories from solid fats, added sugars, soda, and alcohol, and consume fewer vegetables and fruits. So it actually translated into how people ate and lived.
And lends itself to slave food. And slave food is the manipulation of nutrition for profit and for power. And that's what we're seeing in this evolution. Is we're seeing that the foods, this food substances, just like the historical context of those being enslaved and cast off and taken through the diaspora and dropped off in various locations around the world and finally the United States, that where food was used as a weapon. That food was manipulated for profit and for power. We're seeing now the same manipulation of nutrition for profit and for power. We're finding this picture is not just happenstance. This picture highlights some of the most addictive foods out there on surveys. of cheesy pizzas, of ice cream, of cookies, of candy, of chips, the things that you that craving, and it seems like despite your efforts, you tend to go after it and eat it more. And this is what slave food is. And so one of the things we wanted to outline inside of this particular segment of our talk, and I encourage you, if you want more information to look in detail, go and log in on slavefood.org or follow us on Slave Food Project on YouTube, where you can learn more information. But there's a distinct relationship between the spiritual realm and the physical realm. And so one of the things we're trying to outline is the importance in understanding the history behind this. And in the next segment, when we come back again and meet with you all again, Lord willing, we plan to outline more of the detail of the literature as to why these diseases really are killing you in terms of from a literature standpoint and what you can do to overcome it. And that's the goal of following us. But we thank you. Any questions?
There is one question from Judy, and I'm assuming she just wants more elaboration on Guam. She just said in Guam ? So I guess in regards to the cheese.
Oh, yeah. No, well, what I found when I was in Guam is something you find in other places where America basically had colonies, and now Hawaii is a state. But so when you go there, Puerto Rico, Guam, many of the very food programs that were for low-income people in the mainland United States actually were the same in some of these areas, including the Native American territories as well. Like a product like Spam, which is something most of us probably don't even think about as Adventists. Spam is the number one places in the world Spam sells is Hawaii, Guam, and South Korea. And it is poisonous food. When I was in Guam, I saw patients with gout, and you could just rub their skin and crystals would fall out of their skin. These are the crystals that are supposed to be inside your joint when you have gout. It would just come straight out of their skin. I had a patient like that. So yeah, a lot of this stuff was exported. Remember, somebody's making a lot of money off of this. If you can take taxpayer dollars and pay the farmers to sell their garbage, I mean, the government cheese is a part of the dairy process they couldn't use to do anything else. They box it up and make it into cheese and ship it around the world. Somebody's making a fortune selling their trash, basically. And of course, that's just what happened in slavery. They took the worst parts of the food, the rotted food, the parts of the animal nobody else would in their right mind would want to eat, and they gave it to the slaves. So that process has been happening for a long time.
And then we have another question from Judy, and she wants to know what's the best way to stay consistent on eating healthy?
That's a good question. So definitely want to ask you to stay tuned in for next week. But briefly in summary, I think one of the key things is to be very intentional in your efforts. Be very intentional and plan, which really means that you start before you even have your meal. You plan before you even walk into the kitchen, that you don't allow chance to come and play a role in what you're going to particularly eat. And so today's day and age, what we're able to do is we're able to search, we're able to research, we're able to know. When I drive to a location pre-COVID, oftentimes I survey what's going to be in that area, what I can gain access to, so I'm not leaving it to chance when I walk in.
Do we have any more questions?
Thank you for the questions, Judy.
Absolutely.
All righty. I was like, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's really important people tune into the next installment in 2 weeks. We'll go a lot more into diet and exercise and what the dangers of certain foods and not. And so it was asked everybody tune in 2 weeks and invite others to do so as well.
There was a comment saying that most vegetarian foods are loaded with salt.
No, that's not true. Most vegetarian food is not loaded with salt. Most processed vegetarian food is loaded with salt. If you're eating broccoli and kale straight off the bush, off the vine, you're not going to get any of that salt. You're only going to get the salt natural in the food. So it's not being vegetarian. The problem with a lot of us at Adventists, we equate vegetarianism with the processed meat substitutes that most of us were fed our whole lives. But that's really not vegetarianism. That's more processed food, which we'll show you next time, really doesn't do you any good either.
Absolutely.
And then there's another question. How do we transition to vegetarian food?
Yeah, one of the things, and so once again, we are, I hate to steal the thunder, but I love the questions. And so one of the things that I oftentimes say is that you want to have the foods that have singular names in it. So you want to go ahead and start off and say, what can I add to my plate? So in other words, what I mean by that is blueberries have one name. Broccoli has one name. Kale has one name. When you read a box for whatever the processed food is, it has and the ingredients have multiple labels on it. And so you want to go ahead and figure what you can add to your diet. The best way that you can do it is to go ahead and say, I'm going to commit to what vegetable do I want to try this week? How much of it? How often? What type of fruit do I want to try? Write it down, be very specific, write the amount down, when you're going to do it, how you're going to get it into your body. And once you do that, now you hold yourself accountable. How you can go ahead and incorporate that. And you want to begin the process of transforming your taste buds. And that's the easiest way to start is work through the process of addition as opposed to subtraction.
Okay, so I am going to, I first want to introduce the next series presentation. It will take place on February 25th at the same time, same locations. It will be done by Dr. Walsh and Dr. Batiste again. So you see their lovely faces one more time, and they'll be talking more in depth on this topic. So I'm going to close this out with prayer. And okay. So dear God, thank you for letting us all be here again tonight and learning this great information that can help us in our everyday lives and just live a better, healthier life. Please allow people to stay safe and stay healthy through these times, and that you just look over and after all of us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen.
Amen.